everybody, it's Eric Papenfoos. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today, Kathy and I have taken you with us on the road to the great windy city of Chicago. A little bit of wind here right at the moment, isn't there, Kathy?
Yeah.
Well, at any rate, we're on Michigan Avenue. Lake Michigan is behind us. And if you look that way, you're going to see why Chicago has that reputation for amazing skyscrapers. That's the Art Institute down that way. And if you pan back to me and you look at the building behind us, this is one of the few surviving examples of the architecture of the great architect Louis Sullivan. And I thought for Buy Day, what better book to bring on a trip to Chicago than Louis Sullivan's autobiography? Opening up our box, we see this blue book. Now we have 2 copies of this autobiography at the Scholar, so you might want to come in and pick up the one that's still there. It is an autobiography of Louis Sullivan by Louis Sullivan, but it really is an autobiography of his ideas and his thoughts, which makes it particularly interesting. And Louis Sullivan was famous for being considered the father of the skyscraper. He was considered the mentor and was the mentor for Frank Lloyd Wright. In fact, Frank Lloyd Wright worked under Sullivan in designing the building behind us, which is really cool. Now, I think we can get into the building in just a minute, but let's look at the architecture a tiny bit. He held the conviction that no architectural dictum or tradition or superstition or habit should stand in the way of realizing an honest architecture based on well-defined needs and useful purposes, the function determining the form expressing the function. Yeah, that's Louis Sullivan. He coined the term form follows function, which basically means the way a building looks should represent the building's use. And what's really interesting about this building, Kathy, is that it was one of the first multi-use buildings designed anywhere in America. It houses both a theater, which was an opera house, an incredible theater, which is still going today. We've seen shows there, but it also had a hotel and offices. And the hotel and the office portions were designed to help sort of subsidize the auditorium, and it worked pretty well. This building opened in 1889. Sullivan was at the height of his powers, and Sullivan's career sort of spans the period from the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 all the way through the Great Columbian Exposition of 1893. So this building's right in the middle of it. You want to know another interesting fact about the building?
Yes.
When this building was built in Chicago, it was, at that time, the tallest building in Chicago. So in 1889, that was the tallest building. All the skyscrapers are all indebted to Sullivan. And this book, an autobiography of an idea, inspired a famous modernist author, one of our famous authors at the Scholar, to write a book called The Fountainhead. And you know who I'm referring to. It's Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand never uses the term fountainhead at all anywhere in the book, other than in the title, but Sullivan uses it throughout the book here. I'll just read you a little passage. In the carrying out of his own program, Lewis's thoughts turned definitively towards France. He wished now to go to the fountainhead of theory. And that's right. The characters in the Fountainhead are based on Louis Sullivan. I think to appreciate the building, you also have to go inside. But before we go inside, Kathy, what do you think? What do you think? Does form follow function?
Oh, so beautiful.
Yeah, you've got the light, you've got the arches. You don't have you've got a strong, bold. Look at the way the foundation. The foundation is designed, but at the same time modern, and it was very modern for its day. Very modern compared to the building next door, which is definitely Beaux-Arts and much more in keeping with sort of a neoclassical tradition. But let's go inside. So we've now made it into the lobby of the auditorium portion of the building. You were looking at the hotel from across the street there, but now this is the auditorium. We can't go in the auditorium because there isn't a show today. But as the sign says, Prince played here, the Grateful Dead played here, Jimi Hendrix played here. And going back to Louis Sullivan's time, it was designed to be, and in fact, Frank Lloyd Wright called it the best acoustics of any theater anywhere in the world, right here in Chicago. But I wanted to bring you in here because you can also see that Sullivan, while known for his modernism and his skyscrapers, did not discount the importance of decoration, of design. And you have these beautiful stained glass windows up high This one being the Book of Knowledge, were designed in 1889 for Sullivan and for the building. Sullivan had his actual architecture office here in the building. And Kathy, you and I once did a house call at a person's house. Yes. Who claimed to have the windows from Sullivan's office, and she had made them into bookcases. They were not for sale, or we would have gotten them, but right. They were similar in design. At any rate, whenever we go to a new city, we like to bring a historic guidebook, don't we? Yes. And I like this one because this is the authentic guide to Chicago from 1893. Now, it has a lot of the buildings that you'll see in it, including the Auditorium. It is a little bit a pre-modern skyscraper, but it's very interesting. And I wanted to mention the exposition because that was the other great event in Chicago. They called it the World's Fair. It was celebrating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus. That really put Chicago on the map. Chicago had to compete against New York to get this, and other cities too, but really mostly against the Vanderbilts and the others in New York that were trying to lure it there. They got it, they put it on the map, and it was the World's Fair which started a movement that we're familiar with in Harrisburg called the City Beautiful movement. Right. This is a souvenir of some of the designs, and what you'll notice about these designs, Kathy, is that they are all not modern. And sure, it was celebrating 400 years, but they are in the French Beaux-Arts style. And although Louis Sullivan did design one of the buildings, I found it interesting that this souvenir booklet did not include his building. It included all the other architects, but it was his building that was the greatest. Now, these buildings were not designed to last, believe it or not. They were designed oftentimes out of a sort of white stucco plaster. Sullivan's was one that had color, but he just didn't agree with any aspect of what was going on there. But it was the whiteness of the buildings plus the new incandescent lighting that gave Chicago the name the White City. And this theater, by the way, first theater to have central air and first theater to have 100% incandescent electric lighting, which is sort of cool. At any rate, Sullivan, by the time of the World's Fair, really is sort of starting to go out of fashion. And by the end of his life, when he is writing his autobiography, he's poor and destitute. And actually, it's other architects, including Frank Lloyd Wright, who support and encourage him to write that autobiography as something of a fundraiser to both secure his legacy, but also to get him some money in his declining years. But no trip to Chicago would be complete without the story of the Chicago fire. And that's going to be our next stop, because what made Louis Sullivan so great was that he had a blank canvas to work on. One of the, shall we say, only positive things to come out of the Great Chicago Fire was that there was much building to do. Well, we've come to the end of our walk and the end of our day. It's gotten a little bit colder, hasn't it, Kathy? The sun has set. We've got our jackets on, but we made it to the water tower. And I promised you a story about the Great Chicago Fire. This is one of the few structures which actually survived the fire. We saw miles and miles of Chicago architecture burn in 1871. In fact, a greater footprint than the entire city of Harrisburg burned to the ground. Ironically, the water tower and the pump house, which is right behind it, survived, but they stopped pumping water from Lake Michigan because the roof of the pump house caught on fire. Most of the buildings prior to the Great Fire were made out of wood. They had tar roofs. And then after the Great Fire, there was a time of tremendous building and growth. I brought one more guidebook. This is Picturesque Chicago from the time of the Columbian Exhibition, probably sold by vendors there. And I thought we could end with some stereo views, because why not? By the way, there's the water tower as it stood after the Great Fire. And I have a stereo view of the water tower standing after the Great Fire if you come in. And this is by Lovejoy and Foster. They were photographers that really caught the moment. They moved to Chicago in 1871. Their studio and half of the city burned down, and they went into business basically selling views of the devastation of the fire. Here's an example of one of their fire views. That's the old post office, if you can see it. But basically views of ruins. But then they became the great photographer of Chicago's rebuilding. And I like these stereo views even more because you begin to see the structures that were rebuilt. immediately following the fire, including that wonderful hotel there and that other hotel there. By the way, the top hotel, that's where brownies were invented. Did you know that brownies were invented for the Chicago Exposition? They wanted like a portable cake, chocolate-like, and they came up with brownies. You recognize this building because that's the auditorium where we were earlier. But I should note that the guidebook says, and I think this is true, that among the many magnificent structures of Chicago, the auditorium is the greatest. It is the most famous building in the American continent, and once a grand opera house, a superb hotel, and a mammoth office building. It is the modern ideal, like the Colosseum in Rome. So pretty cool there. All right, we don't have a funny book to end on, but we do have a funny anecdote. Now look closely at the building behind me. All right. Now, what fast food chain was so inspired by the Chicago Water Tower that it decided to design its own buildings to look just like that? They emerged in the aftermath of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It's White Castle. White Castle, designed to look like the water tower. Perhaps appropriate that the fire engines are coming. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll watch next Friday and every Friday at noon for more adventures in the world of books.